I give you Professor Ross Garnaut, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for that introduction, and thanks to Ross and Uncle Rodney for the earlier remarks. Sorry I'm not with you. We're very close to, I hope, to being able to get together, but not quite there yet between Melbourne and Adelaide. I've got a lot of interest in South Australia, have for a long time. When I was doing the climate change review for all the governments of Australia, state, territory and federal, back in 2007 and 2008, the report that Gary referred to, I identified South Australia as the most promising place in Australia to lead the decarbonisation challenge, because South Australia had both at the same time the most expensive and difficult resources of the old economy, the low quality coal from Lee Creek being taken by rail down to Port Augusta, and also had the best combinations of solar and wind close to the transmission networks of any Australian state. So it was a good place to start, and South Australia's made a good use of that opportunity. There were days during the year, especially when demand for power was not so great at the weekend, when solar and wind were supplying 100% of the power required by the network, and South Australia also exporting a little bit interstate on the interconnectors. That's very unusual. In fact, it hasn't been done in any other jurisdiction yet. That's the way the world will get most of its power in a few decades' time. We'll get nearly all of its power, but South Australia is leading the way. As a result, South Australia's had some particular challenges. It's had to work out the systems, the technologies, the deployment of assets that's necessary to give you stable and secure power when it's reliant on intermittent sources. So sunlight's only available certain hours of the day. Wind's sometimes there and sometimes not. And so you need to support it with a whole range of arrangements to give you flexibility. And South Australia's done a good job of that. You had the blackout back in 2015, which was blamed on the high percentage of renewables, when the percentage was very much lower than it is now. In fact, it was caused by climate change, an unprecedented cyclonic type event, severe winds that blew down about 20 of the transmission towers, taking the wires between Port Augusta and Adelaide, and that triggered a chain reaction that shut down other parts of the system, and that very difficult blackout occurred. Since then, South Australia's put in place large-scale storage and batteries, arrangements for backup, a whole range of things that mean that in the last couple of years, by the standard measures, South Australia's had the most reliable power of all the states of Australia. So the pioneering is continuing. That gives South Australia quite a big advantage in industry in the zero carbon world, when everyone is getting their energy from renewable sources without emissions. Then the countries and the states and the regions with the best renewable energy resources will be the best locations for industry based on energy. So South Australia has a lot of advantages, and they're already being used in the Upper Spencer Gulf. They'll become much more important, some in Adelaide as well, bringing power down through the transmission lines. So I see the leading position of South Australia continuing. You never get innovation just from good resources. You need a lot of human brains. That ends up being the most important resource, and usually the scarcest resource, to introduce the new technologies, to invent new ways of doing things, and to manage things in different ways. A lot of these challenges that Gary and the Essential Services Commission are facing, doing all of that well ends up being the key to managing the transition well. And South Australia's playing a leading role in all of those things, including in technological change, the very important research that's going on to reduce methane emissions from cattle and sheep, from new systems of feeding. A lot of the pioneering work's being done here, a lot of the work on applying new technologies. It was South Australia's big battery that showed Australia how important that can be in stabilising a system depending on solar and wind, and that's taking off in the rest of Australia now. During Uncle Rodney's very welcome, our minds went to how the people who managed this continent for 60,000 years before white settlers came from Europe did have such an effective response to sustainability. But even that traditional knowledge, which is hugely valuable today, would have to require a lot of innovation to deal with the temperature increases, the climatic conditions that would exist if we didn't succeed in being part of the world effort to deal with climate change. The average temperature increase in Australia already since pre-industrial times, which results from the higher greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, on average across the Australian continent, it's already 1.4 degrees, and that's had quite a big effect. It's made extreme weather events more severe, heat waves, cyclonic events, big wind events like those that blew down the transmission towers a few years ago, rainfall events. But if the world succeeds in, or the average increase in the whole world has been about 1.1 degrees so far. It's more over land and it's more over sun land than others, and Australia is in many ways more vulnerable than other parts of the world, so we're copying it higher than the world average. But if the world average is kept to what the United Nations is now committed to, the United Nations meeting in Glasgow under with the British government in the chair, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson playing a major role. It's focused on holding global temperature increases on average to 1.5 degrees. If the world succeeds in that, then we've had most of the increase we're going to get. The increase we've already had is severe. The drying, the reduction in average rainfall in southern Australia, especially the Mediterranean areas, the westward facing landscapes facing the westerly winds, southwest of WA, the Eyre Peninsula, the York Peninsula, the coast north and south of Adelaide, and then Western Victoria. These are the regions of the world that have experienced the biggest change in rainfall so far. Very similar thing has happened in the same latitudes, the same types of climatic conditions on other continents, Southwest Africa, Chile, in these latitudes. and the Mediterranean itself, Morocco and Spain and Italy, and California, San Francisco, the central part of California, very severe reductions in rainfall. So we already face those challenges. That's having a big effect on water flows, a serious effect on the Murray-Darling system. If we don't all cooperate in adjusting to that by reducing the demands we make on those waterways, then we'll very severely damage water systems that have been part of the life of Australians for many tens of thousands of years. Very important part of the Australian landscape. Irreparable damage will be done to those unless we manage water in a different way. So what's already happened is quite a challenge. If we succeed in what the British government and the United Nations were setting out to achieve in Glasgow in the last few weeks, there's a bit more to come, but we've had most of the damage. But if we fail badly, then the consequences will be catastrophic. In fact, if we fail badly, I think we create a world in which social justice becomes very, very difficult. It would be a world of such severe disruption that normal political systems would be disrupted. People will be displaced from many developing regions of the world. It will be very hard for a coherent government at all levels to be maintained. And so very important that that the world does succeed in what many leaders of the world were trying to do in Glasgow. Just before moving on from Uncle Rodney's introductory remarks, there are a lot of lessons from Indigenous Australia in managing the landscape, even though if temperature keeps rising a lot, then we'll go way outside the experience of all Australians, including the original Australians. In my first report, 2007 and 8, one of the new technologies for reducing emissions that I highlighted was the potential for using traditional methods of savanna burning in Northern Australia. And I was just talking to people from the Indigenous Land and Sea Council about progress in that, just talking to them yesterday. And that's a tremendous success story, how Aboriginal communities using savanna burning techniques to fire land as it was fired for tens of thousands of years, while the grasses and growth is still green and wet and fresh. So you don't get hot fires and you don't get big fires late in the season that burns down everything and takes away the carbon stock. And Indigenous communities are doing very well out of making that work, being rewarded with carbon credits, which are increasing in value, and then using that in East Arnhem Land very effectively to use that money, which is their own, to expand community services of various kinds. So that's a success story. On Glasgow, it's the 26th of these annual meetings of governments since the first in Berlin in '95, and international cooperation is hard. We're not used to all the countries of the world working together, but in a halting sort of a way, we've made progress. Big progress in Paris in December 2015, when, particularly through the leadership of President Obama of the United States and President Xi of China, and the hosts, the French government, there was a strong commitment to make an effort to hold temperature increases below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. And And it was agreed that countries would voluntarily make their commitments and see if that added up to enough to stop really bad outcomes. And then because the commitments weren't going to add up to good enough outcomes, there were going to be 5 yearly meetings of a similar kind to upgrade everyone's commitments until they were good enough to stop dangerous climate change. Well, the first of those updates was going to be 2020 in Glasgow. Because of COVID, that was postponed until 2021. And so it's happened in the last few weeks. Very important meeting to upgrade those commitments. Well, there was some important progress. There had been one developed country, one developed democracy that had, before the lead up to Glasgow, been the only country not to commit itself to zero net emissions by 2050, and that was Australia. But Australia joined the rest of the developed world in Glasgow. In that, there was also a commitment of all countries to upgrade their short-term commitments, because promising to do something in 30 years' time is not enough given the urgency of the problem. So countries were going to come back with stronger commitments for 2030. Well, Australia stands out as the one developed country that didn't upgrade its commitments, and it seems that our Prime Minister promised our Deputy Prime Minister and a few members of his party that we wouldn't do that. And so we're still outside the international consensus on that question. We also failed to join the rest of the developed world in commitments to reduce methane emissions, methane a particularly powerful greenhouse gas. Tragedy there is that we could do that very effectively, including using some of the new knowledge that's being developed in South Australia. It wouldn't cost us much. In fact, if we did it properly, might even make us more prosperous. But really, as a matter of principle, our government didn't join that international effort, in that case led by President Biden of the United States. Nor did we join quite a strong momentum amongst other developed countries to do something to phase out coal use by an early date. South Australia's already done that, of course. And interesting that there are more jobs related to the new energy, using it and generating it in Port Augusta now than there used to be in the old coal-based generator. So it can be consistent with the transition, can be consistent to maintaining employment. The rest of the country could do what South Australia has done, but we didn't make any step there. So we're out of step. So that's disappointing, but the world as a whole did make some progress. And we did make that progress of joining the rest of the world, at least on the 2050 commitment. We're going to be given another chance because the conference agreed that instead of waiting another 5 years, that the next meeting in Egypt would be would give a chance to those that hadn't stepped up to the mark this year to do so. And Australia is the one developed country that's right in the focus of international attention on that matter. Amongst the developing countries, it's always been accepted that the developed countries would move first because they're in a better position to do so, and also are not responsible for the same historical emissions as the developing. But still, the developing countries have to make big moves soon, or we won't get there. They're just too important in the whole scene. China's committed to zero emissions by 2060. China, a big, sophisticated economy. It's got the capacity to move faster. China will have to have zero net emissions before 2060 if the world's to succeed. India made a commitment to zero net emissions by 2070. Big step for India. India's a much poorer country than China and can't move as fast, but and it is important that they at least made that commitment, but they've got further to go. Russia, for the first time, made a firm commitment, in its case, joining China 2060. Other developing countries were saying they would go faster if they received more support from the developed countries for the energy transmission. And certainly our playing our part, doing our fair share in provision of finance for the adjustment is important. For Australia, we've got, I've mentioned that South Australia has got particularly good combinations of solar and wind resources, but Australia as a whole is very well placed. The transition is much cheaper here. In fact, energy costs can be lower once we've made the transition, and transport costs can be lower. The fuel required for running an electric vehicle is very low cost if it comes from renewable energy than if it comes from petrol or diesel. At the moment, the capital cost of electric vehicles, the upfront cost is higher than the internal combustion engine. It will end up being lower because they're simpler engines, and maintenance will be lower, and they'll last much longer because they're simpler engines. So eventually we're going to get lower cost transport. Initially, they're expensive. Costs will come down like renewable energy and batteries as the volume of manufacture increases. But there's certainly an initial cost. Back in my initial report for all the states and territories, I suggested that we would move most easily, smoothly, and at lowest cost if we had a countrywide carbon price. Gary mentioned that the states have been working on that, and my work initially was commissioned by the states, and it became a federal state initiative after Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. We actually got quite a long way with implementing an emission trading scheme. It was passed by the House of Representatives and then defeated in the Senate. And then with the multi-party Committee on Climate Change that was formed when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister, we actually had legislation working for a couple of years. We had a carbon price that did put up the price of goods and services that use a lot of power a lot, but it raised a lot of money. And the $7 billion that was collected in per annum revenue was used to raise Social Security payments, cut income tax on low earners, and provide various other compensations. And we were very confident from the modeling for that people on low or average incomes, including Social Security beneficiaries, would be as well off or better off once they received the payment and paid the modestly higher prices than otherwise. Well, that was abolished, and so now we've got policies, to the extent we've got policies that don't yield revenue for compensation. So that's a bit more of a challenge, but compensation still can come where required, but it has to be paid for by general taxes and not taxes on the businesses that are emitting carbon. The biggest social justice issue through this transition is really maintaining employment for all Australians that want and need work, and keeping in place a general social security system that effectively looks after all Australians in need. And it was those general questions that I addressed in my recent book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. I noted there that we had a very bad record on unemployment, and especially underemployment, in the last 7 or 8 years. In most developed countries, unemployment was very high in 2013 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, but in other developed countries it came down quite rapidly. America from 10 point something in 2013 down to 3.5 in 2019. That's the general unemployment rate. We were just stuck at 5 point something, and we seem to be satisfied with being stuck. And underemployment rose very quickly in Australia during that period. Underemployment ending up being as important for disappointment of of hopes and expectations as unemployment. Now, the good news there is that the Reserve Bank is much more focused on full employment now than it was. I was very critical of them in the book Reset. I hope that was helpful to their reconsideration, but they're certainly running monetary policy now in a way that makes them much more committed to full employment. I suggest in the book that in the circumstances that we're in after the pandemic, that we're more likely to be able to comprehensively look after the interests of Australians in difficult circumstances if we move to a more comprehensive system of income support. I call it Australian income security. Some people call the same sort of system negative income tax. Others call it a universal basic income. I wouldn't make it quite universal. I'd exclude the richest Australians with large amounts of wealth or income, but I'd make it available to most Australians. It would be a payment initially at about the New Start rate for people in the circumstances of people currently unemployed, higher rates for people on other benefits. But all Australians would get a basic payment into their bank account every fortnight, whether they were unemployed or not, and then they'd pay tax on at a moderate rate from their first dollar of income. So you wouldn't have very high withdrawal of income when people on part-time work go beyond a limited number of hours, as is the case now. When people start losing their Social Security payments on top of some payment of tax, when they go from a few hours employment to more employment, that becomes a very big disincentive to full participation in the labour force. And that's not good for the economy, but it's not good for getting people out of poverty traps and giving people secure incomes, which I thought was going to be very important in the structural adjustment that was going to be part of the transitions we're going through, the post-pandemic transition and also the climate and energy transition. I made that suggestion in the series of lectures on reset that I gave through 2020. And then in the book, so far, the government, Commonwealth government, has not taken that up, but there's been a fair bit of discussion of the issue. I still think it would be an important underpinning for social justice in the circumstances through which Australia will be going in the period immediately ahead. Gary and Ross, I might just leave it there, and very happy to answer questions on any of those things or others.
Thank you, Ross. The other Ross, not quite in the room, but you know, it's actually quite unusual for me to be on a podium or in a conference setting where there are two Rosses in the room. So it's we also have a connection, which is that in 1975, I too was in New Guinea, but I was returning back to Australia with my family after they'd lived in New Guinea for 40 years. So it was kind of always nice to have. New Guinea was a wonderful place at that point in time. Unfortunately, the boarding school I'd been at in Brisbane had suggested that it was going to be difficult for me to return because I'd been a bit naughty, and they thought that the next time I did anything that was particularly naughty, they were going to have to send me completely home. So my family said, well, it's time to move. Better get him out of there. And of course, that was at a point in time where I was old enough to grow up with Joe Bjelke-Petersen. And interestingly, one of the things that Joe did at that point in time was that he'd introduced this legislative framework that basically was saying, well, he was about to introduce by the time I was being sent from school, a legislative framework that banned marching, banned protest, banned the capacity. And in fact, if there were 3 of you who walked down the street side by side, you could be arrested. And indeed, over the next few years, quite a few people were arrested for walking down the street, sometimes carrying protest placards, sometimes just walking together. And yes, eventually, fortunately, that piece of legislation was defeated and changed. But in fact, it's very interesting to think about, well, how do you achieve change as a community? And so, Ross, I'm interested, the take-up. So you've put some pretty impressive, incredibly thoughtful ideas out there. How hard has it been to try and get people to really take up and take some genuine interest in those issues? And while he's answering that, those of you that have got questions from the floor will find a microphone to get to you, and Jen Cleary, and we've got someone at the back there. So Ross.
Well, that's different. It's been different at different times in history, Ross, and I'm even older than you. So I remember a lot of times in history. I lived through them, but we went through a particularly good time for thoughtful discussion of policy and thoughtful policy change when I was working for Bob Hawke, and for a decade or so after that, when someone had an idea that was put forward as being in the public interest, you could discuss it very carefully, and there was a fair chance that if it's held up in discussion, it would be implemented. That was the time, amongst other things, where we got the universal family payments for children, which made quite a big difference to circumstances of lots of low-income families with children. It's time we got Medicare and a number of other basic changes. I was talking to, in the suburb that I'm in Melbourne, we happen to have near me 2 former Deputy Prime Ministers of Australia, Brian Howe and Jenny Macklin, who each played roles as ministers responsible for social security, and talked to them about some of the changes in the environment of policy making over time. So that was a good time. It's a particularly difficult time at the moment, I think. Vested interests are more influential in policy than they used to be. They've become much more clever at closing down discussion, and money speaks very loudly. And so anything that might involve increases in taxation to pay for improved services quickly runs into a lot of attack, very well organized attack. So it is more difficult just at the moment. But I think we've got to keep ideas going, get serious discussion of ideas, so that when we do have governments that are prepared to reform in the public interest, that we've got well thought out ideas for them to take up. But even in current circumstances, there can be some changes. I think the change in the Reserve Bank's attitude to full employment in the last year, after 7 or 8 years of really not being focused on full employment at all, is a very important change. I think as a result, we'll shift from having unemployment at 5 point something, just stuck there from 2013 to 2019. I think we will get down to levels closer to what I would consider to be full employment. I would not be surprised if we end up with unemployment at 3.5% or lower. As I've mentioned, underemployment is very important as well. Underemployment will fall if we get overall unemployment down to there. So that's one area where I think the discussion has moved policy. It's disgraceful that we were unconcerned about unemployment and underemployment for half a dozen years, but at least the Reserve Bank is taking it seriously now, and better late than never. But on the universal income payment to Australians, Australian income security, we haven't had enough discussion of that yet for it to gain momentum. But I think that that will, if it were introduced, it would actually have some quite big economic benefits. Once we get to full employment, labour becomes scarce, and which it hasn't been in this period of underemployment and unemployment, and it becomes very important to get more for the economy, that more people participate, work the number of hours they'd like to work. And if you can get down the effective tax rates involved in withdrawing Social Security on top of tax, when people go from very short hours to more hours of work, I think that will bring a lot more people into more employment and be very good for the economy. That will partly pay for the Australian income security. So I think a lot of discussion of that so that our leaders become aware that there's a lot of Australians thinking that change in this area is important is the key. We are a democracy, a huge advantage for a society to be a democracy, which means that we can have influence, but we only have influence if we're participants in the process, and good participation begins in thorough discussion of the policy possibilities.
Thank you. So we've got some time, just a little bit more time for, I'm being told only. Can you just introduce yourself? And I'll introduce you, Jen, because you're Dr. Jen Cleary, and Jen's actually one of the members of the SACOSS board. And so we're very pleased that she's here, but she's also the CEO of a very important organisation working across the west and northwest of the state.
Good morning, Professor Garnaut. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. As Ross said, I'm Jen Cleary. I'm from the Upper Spencer Gulf region in South Australia, and have met you previously when you came and addressed the Upper Spencer Gulf Common Purpose Group. My question is, you talked about several things, but including full employment and the idea of manufacturing coming back to places like South Australia as a result of the switch to renewables. One of the challenges we face in the Upper Spencer Gulf, which is obviously one of those areas that is heavily involved in renewables production, is the cost of getting goods to market. And I wanted to get your take on whether or not there is a policy lever that could be used to mitigate costs to market through, cheaper power tariffs in those regions, for example.
Yeah, well, there's lots that can be done to reduce the cost of power in the zero emissions world. As Gary and the Essential Services Commission knows, there's some challenges in that. Increasingly, the cost of renewable energy is coming down to very low levels, and it will keep getting cheaper, much cheaper than the gas-based power or the coal-based power on which we used to rely. But the cost of poles and wires doesn't become cheaper, and especially with more and more households and businesses producing their own power. There tends to be less power going through the poles and wires, and we guarantee the profitability of the businesses who've invested in poles and wires, effectively guarantee their incomes and give them very high guaranteed incomes. Reduced demand leads to increased costs for poles and wires. What can we do about that? Well, I think there's room for some reform of the way we reward investment in poles and wires. We make it very safe for them, almost like a government bond, but they get returns on capital very much higher than that. So that's one thing that can be done. But the introduction of the electric vehicle introduces some new possibilities, because electric vehicle will end up being a much cheaper form of transport. The running costs will be very low, maintenance costs will be low, it's a simpler engine. The cost of the electricity to run it will be very low compared with diesel and petrol. And capital costs within a few years will be below the costs of the internal combustion engine. the key to making this helpful to reducing power costs will be to make sure that people charge their electric vehicles, or bus companies, or railways, or anyone else, that you charge up your batteries when the poles and wires are not much being used. So you charge them up in the middle of the day when from your home, when if you're at home, if you've got solar on the roof, or you charge it up at night when there's not much demand for power. And in that way, we'll get much more use of the electrical system without any increased investment. So that should bring down the cost to everyone. On the other hand, if we don't make that reform, this is one for Gary, if we don't make that reform, if we just, if people don't think about when they charge, they might be away at work, come back at 5 or 6 o'clock, plug in, use a lot of power in filling up the battery at peak hour. And that will mean that there'll be excess demand, and there'll be constraints on the transmission and distribution system. We'll have to invest more and pay those high rates of return to the distribution companies, and power costs will go up. So if we do it right, the introduction of electric vehicle will bring down everyone's cost of power as well as their cost of transport. If we don't think ahead and just let events take their course, it could end up increasing the cost of power. So that's just one example of how we've got to give some thought in advance to managing these changes.
All right, Ross, I think we've got time for one more question. Otherwise, I'm going to be thrown out of the role of being host for the day.
Hi, my name's Peter Croft. I'm a volunteer with COTA. My question follows on from your comments about electric vehicles. Some countries have tried to push the uptake of electric vehicles by setting emission standards and averaging out, if you like, of emissions from their internal combustion and electric vehicles. So reducing emissions from, say, 150 grams per kilometre to 90 grams per kilometre, that sort of figure. Our government doesn't seem to have taken that up, but it does seem to be a policy which wouldn't cost the government very much, but would in fact achieve a greater flow of vehicles to Australia, and eventually a lower cost. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that would have been a good move, but the government does seem to be resisting that at a national level. Government's putting some money into charging stations for electric vehicles. That's the extent of their policy at the moment, but was much less than other developed country governments are. So we're a long way behind. We've got a much smaller uptake of electric vehicles than other countries. As a result, we're not a very interesting market. So a lot of car companies are not bothering to sell electric vehicles in Australia, and so the cost of electric vehicles is much higher in Australia than in other comparable countries. So that's all a pity. But state governments are doing some important things. The state government of New South Wales has introduced a policy that all fleets, it will subsidise the adoption of cars. And part of the Minister for Energy, who's now the Treasurer as well, Matt Keane, said that he sees this as getting a lot more second-hand cars, electric cars on the market in a couple of years, because typically fleets use cars a lot for a couple of years and then sell them and buy new ones. And that, so anything that increases the stock of new cars will increase the stock of second-hand cars down the track. So any policy to increase take-up is a necessary step in making cheaper second-hand cars available further down the track. And the electric vehicle is going to last a lot longer than the internal combustion engine, simply because there are far fewer moving parts. I've seen figures, less than 100 moving parts compared with nearly 1,000. And so not as many things to go wrong. They'll last for much longer. So they'll be much better as second-hand vehicles. So the sooner we get ourselves into that state, the better. We won't get there until we're encouraging more new electric vehicles into the market. We're doing less than any other developed country. That's a pity. but anything we did to catch up would in the end be helpful for cheaper transport for Australians.
Ross, at that point, I need to bring this conversation to a close. Do you want to hold up your book so that you can do one more advert for Reset?
Yeah.
It's worth a read. You've got a bit of a précis of some of the content this morning. So, but can you just join me? And of course, our friends at SACOSS, Gary, are now charged with a whole lot of responsibility for sorting out the electric car. Oh, well, that's true. So the person sitting next to you who, just happens to work for the government in a particularly important role might also have a role in helping our way through this process. So, yes. Can I say thank you again, Ross, for taking the time to join us this morning? I know you've got things to go on to, but we've really appreciated your presence and your thoughtfulness and the span with which you come at this question and the experience that you bring to the conversation. So please join me in thanking Ross.